As you know, 90-Second Website Builder gives you a number of features for building your website. Among them are the navigation tools, and as you know by now, there's a set of navigation tools. So you have a lot of options in creating navigation for your website. One of my favorites is the CSS menu, and I want to talk to you about that specific tool in this video and why I like the CSS menu so much. Of course, it's under the navigation tools. It's the very first one. If you click on this and draw a box, you'll end up with a CSS menu. It starts you with 4 buttons, but of course this is all changeable. And I'm going to double click on this and open it up. Before we go into this, let me tell you why I like the CSS menu. The key word here is CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. That's a type of web programming or protocol that places a certain kind of code on your website. CSS code is cleaner, faster loading code than conventional code. And the reason why that's important is because obviously it's good for your website to load faster, not only for your user's experience, but even for search engine optimization purposes. Google likes websites that load faster. So anytime you can use CSS in your web design, it's going to be better for the most part. So that's one of the main reasons I like the CSS menu. The other reason is I like it just because it's easy to work with and it has so many variations and features. You can make your navigation menu be just about anything you can imagine if you learn to use the CSS menu. Now in this first tab, of course, under General is where we would design the structure of our menu, meaning what buttons we want to have, how many, and how many of these are main menu items and how many of these are submenu items. So for example, I can obviously edit these and change what these say and where they link to by simply clicking the edit button and changing the name of this to whatever I want it to be and linking it to whatever I want to link it to. But I can also add submenu items. So if I add a button and call it something, and of course I could link it to another page, I can decide that it goes under here because I had selected the home button when I added this button and it put one here. If I didn't have one selected, if I was just up here and I added a button, you'll see it gets added to the main menu. But I can always move these around. If I wanted a menu item to be within a hierarchy, say under this button, I could drag it up to it and it will do that. Another thing you can do is you can make submenus and sub-submenus. Watch. Let's add another item. Click OK. And now I've put this button under this submenu. This is a hierarchy or a structure that we can make, and you can design that any way you want to. So more about that later. Let's go to the Style tab, which lets us decide the look or the layout of this menu. Now, this window is broken up into 3 sections that are very important. This top area, called Main Menu, always pertains to the look and the layout of the main menu items. And so in the Preview section, we're looking at these main menu items. These are the ones that are in the top level of the hierarchy. And that's what this will always pertain to. The submenu section is always going to pertain to what it looks like for those items that are in submenus. So for example, here in this demonstration, we have some submenus and sub-submenus. And so the way they look and the way they behave will be determined by this section called submenu. So let's talk about the main menu first. So right now we have sort of this gray and white default CSS menu, but of course we can change that in so many ways, it's amazing. We'll just go through most of these. It would take too long to go through every possible configuration, but you'll get the idea. Under the main layout subtab here under main menu, we can decide whether this is going to be a horizontal, which it is now, or a vertical, which is this, or even a responsive menu, which means the size of this menu will respond to the size of the browser window. Remember, you're able to make responsive websites now with 90-Second Website Builder version 10, and this is one way to do that as well. So you can make your menu respond to the size of the browser. That's very important. Right now, for this demonstration, we'll keep this at horizontal. The alignment should be obvious. You can make this be left, center, or right. The button sizes, each of these buttons, can be determined by this fixed width if you want. Right now I have it fixed at 80. If I wanted them to be wider, I could change this number and you can see my buttons got wider. Or I can have them be variable, where they actually are dependent on the size of the text that's in them. So they shrunk down because this button only has the word item 2 in it. And so they'll fit whatever word you want. There's a time to use that if you're trying to save space. In most cases, I like to use the fixed setting so that the buttons all look the same and nice and neat. Of course, you can control the height as well here. The spacing between the buttons is set here. By default, it's 4 pixels, but you can spread them out. As you can see, when I increase this number, the buttons also increase the pixel spacing between each button. Again, 4 is a default and a pretty good size. Padding does something similar. If we change this, you'll see what happens. The padding is how will the main menu sit against the edge of the button object itself. So this whole box represents the navigation object, and we're actually creating padding from the edge of the object. But again, 0 is a better default. You can also decide how far off these submenus will appear when they pop up by setting these numbers. I won't go into detail on that for the sake of time, but you can see how that works. When we click the main menu, this means we're going to set the attributes of the whole object here. So if we want this object to have a border, we'd give it 1 by changing this number. I'll exaggerate it so you can see where that border is appearing. And of course, we could change the color and the mode of that border if we wanted to. Again, I like 0, so we'll leave it at that. And of course, the color would be changed here. Under background, again, this is the background of just these main menu items, not the background of anything else but these. That's why you can see that we have a color of the button as well as a hover color. That's why there's 2. So there's this light gray and this dark gray. That's what these represent. It doesn't have to be a solid color. They can be gradients. And so now we'll be working with 4 colors. Not only the 2 colors in each gradient, but then the hover color, which also has its own 2 colors, and how that's styled. You can also decide on whether you want a border around these buttons, and if so, how big it should be, and what color it should be. And as you can see, I've just adjusted it. You can even make it rounded if you want by adding radius settings to that. And then if you want to add images to your buttons, you can. I would avoid doing this unless you really want to, because one of the advantages of CSS menus is that it doesn't need images to look good. And images start to slow down the load of your page. But if you do want to use images, you can do that. Just use them with caution and don't overload your menu to make it too heavy. But if you do have images you want to replace in here, you can have a normal image and then the image that shows when you hover to create certain special effects. Those images can repeat in both directions, not repeat at all, or have other effects of their own. Whenever you see this option with submenu, it means whenever you're working with an object that has a submenu, what you want it to look like. So for example, this object has a submenu. This one does not. These are standalone, but this has a submenu. So when you make changes to an object that has a submenu, you'll see this in the settings, an object with a submenu. You can also determine the shadows that you want, if you want any, and so you do that by offset. If I add some pixels here and you look at the preview, you can see I've basically added shadows to these. And then of course, the text, what font we want, how it's aligned, the color of that font. Again, padding is important. If we want to change the padding, this is a good demonstration of the difference between an object with a submenu and an object without. So if I change the padding here, you'll see that those 2 buttons that say item 2 are changing because I'm changing the padding left to be right now 25 pixels. Well, why didn't this one change? Well, because this is an object with a submenu. If I wanted to change the padding for that, I'd go up here and change the padding for the objects with submenus, and I could do that here. And now you'll see that that object is being affected by my settings. So now this next section does exactly the same thing, only instead of for these buttons, these settings will apply to all of the sub-menu items. So in other words, if we want to change the border color on the sub-menus, let's make that black and let's make it a little bit thick. Then you can see we've just created a black border on the sub-menus. And the same is true for all of the rest of these settings, all the way down to the text. What text we want to use, how big we want that text to be, will be affected here in the sub-menu. Okay, that gives you a really good idea of what you can do. I'm trying to do this quickly because there's so many different settings you can use. I want you to know what you have to work with. So I'm going to click OK, and you can see I just made this sort of demonstration navigation CSS menu. Let me show you a real world one that I actually use on one of my websites so you can see how I've used the CSS menu. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. This was just a demo. Go back to this page. Here I've created a CSS menu right here. I'm going to take it out of where it was so you can see it a little bit better. What I did was I created a layer. This is a layer that has a black background. And I created the layer because I want it to be responsive and I want it to have an infinite width across my screen. But I put a CSS menu inside of this layer. But in order for it to look right, I made my CSS layer have a black background so that it would fit right inside this layer and look the way I want it to look. You'll also notice that there's some good spacing here. I don't use borders in this case. I just think this is a better look for my website. Let me show you how I did it. If I double click on here, you can see I have quite a hierarchy. I've got only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buttons in the main menu. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you hover over those buttons, there are several sub-menus under them, and I want them to look a certain way. So under the Style tab, I did just that. And as you can see, it gives me a preview of what that's going to look like. I set my main menu button styles here by setting all of these attributes. Here's my background where I made it black, and I changed the hover color just a little bit. I want it to be subtle. I don't have any borders, so I made those 0. I'm not using images or shadows, but I want the text to be a bold 11 points. And I want the text to be white, and I don't want it to hover. So I did all that here. Same thing is true for my submenus. I determined what they looked like down here. And of course, again, I can preview that. Let me show you what it actually looks like on the website. If I click in F5, you can see that my CSS menu does just what I want it to do. I want people to be able to hover over this and have it become this gray box. I also want them to hover over an object that has submenus, which this one does. And as they hover over those, I have a slight and subtle variation. It does exactly what I want it to do based on the styles that I created. That's it for the CSS menu. It's very simple to use and yet very powerful, and like I said, is a great tool to use for your website if you're really concerned about search engine optimization and page load speed and things like that. Then have fun with the CSS menu, because it's a great way to make navigation for your website that you're building with 90-second website builder.